On the upside, our new computer in the classroom got installed yesterday. Fortunately, we can't use it today, but tomorrow when we go back, if we go back, because there's a possibility of more ice, if we go back tomorrow, those of you that do classes online, you should have a lot better internet connection, meaning less lagging on the videos. And I know you're all very happy about that. I know I am, because that was frustrating. On another note, I hope that everyone is staying safe and warm today. We are going to finish chapter 3 today and go ahead and start chapter 4. At least that's the plan. We'll see how far we make it. Let's see. I gotta get used to doing this on my MacBook again. It's been a while since I've had to do it on my MacBook. You guys should see a presentation right now. Yes? No?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Courtney. So yesterday we left off on the color wheel. Important things that we need to remember for the color wheel is our primary colors and our secondary colors. Does anyone know what the primary colors are?
They're blue, yellow, and red.
Yes, very good. And that means our secondary colors are orange, green, and violet. The in-between colors, red, orange, yellow, green, those are called intermediate. And that just means they have slightly more of one color versus another. Of course, if you mix all of your primary colors together, you'll end up with brown. And the reason why we start off on the color wheel discussing primary, secondary, and intermediate colors is because certain colors complement each other very well, meaning they work together. That is called a color scheme. Those are groupings of color that have distinct harmonies. So normally I pace our lectures based on the people writing in class and watching them and seeing when they're done. Today I'm not watching anyone. So if I go too fast, let me know. And I can slow down. I can kind of see Courtney writing, so I might be able to base it off of Courtney's writing. Going back to this, an idea of colors that go well together are yellow and violet. Any color that's directly opposite the color wheel is called a complementary color, meaning they go well together. So red and green go well together. That's the reason why Christmas colors are red and green, actually. They are complementary colors. Also, colors that are next to each other and touching on the color wheel also go well together. So here you see violet and blue violet are next to each other. They go well together. There's also something with colors called cool colors and warm colors. Your cool colors are your purples, blues, and greens. And your warm colors are your red, orange, and yellow. And that has to do with that psychological thing that I mentioned yesterday, where our brains just register certain colors as being warm or cold. And yellow, orange, and red evoke feelings of like sun and summer, whereas blues and violets and greens remind us a bit more of winter. So they're colder colors. Monochromatic is when a painting is done in a single hue with different values and tints of that hue. So I believe when we were looking at the Whistler painting of the fireworks, that was an entirely blue painting. That was monochromatic. An example of a monochromatic painting would be the Mary Course Untitled. I'll go back to that other slide in a second, but here's that Untitled work. It's all done in whites and grays. So this is actually an achromatic painting as well. Analogous colors are the colors that are directly adjacent from each other on the color wheel. So I mentioned earlier they go really well together. Analogous colors do go well together. An example of an artist that uses analogous colors in a painting is Jennifer Bartlett's Trio. And here's that painting there. Every single one of these squares is done with analogous colors, so colors that are directly opposite each other. For example, let me pick out one and see if I can blow it up. The red and blue one there. We go back to our color wheel. We see the red, orange, and the blue, green here. So the other thing to mention about color wheels before we move on any further is once again touching on the idea of cool and warm. So just a reminder, the cool tones are your purple, blue, and green. Your warm tones are red, orange, and yellow. Your cool tones recede into space like the black did yesterday that I mentioned. They have more weight and more mass, whereas your warm tones push forward into space. They have less mass and less weight, so they come forward. And that'll be particularly important when we start studying more contemporary abstract art. So your warm tones push forward, they have less weight and mass. Your cool tones recede, and they have more mass and more weight. That'll also be important when we get to asymmetrical balance today. And that's called the push-pull of color theory. Color theory didn't come about until after World War II, so it's a fairly new concept for us. So we looked at analogous. Analogous are colors that are directly opposite of each other on the color wheel. Complementary colors are, sorry, I got that wrong. Analogous colors are the ones that are next to each other. I thought so. It worded different here. That's wrong. They are not adjacent. They are next to each other. Complementary colors are colors that are directly opposite. Sorry about that. I need to fix that. So your complementary colors are the ones opposite, such as red and green and blue and yellow. Your analogous are the ones that are touching each other. But either way, all of those color groupings, if you do an analogous or a complementary, those are color schemes that work well together. Another color scheme that works well together is if you used cool tones for an entire painting or if you used warm tones for an entire painting. Okay, moving on from color, we're going to go into textures. So it's easy to understand textures for sculptures, but paintings also have textures. So we're going to touch on how paintings have textures in a second. But first, we're going to focus on the easy one for sculptures. Textures are things that can be felt or experienced. Sometimes artists imply textures with paint, and that has a particular vocabulary word, which we'll get to in a second. A great example of an art piece that has texture is Merritt Oppenheim's Object, which is this sculpture here. It clearly has texture. Texture is fur. Another example of texture can be seen in the pottery from the Tang Dynasty. They would use a particular glaze that had a chemical composition that created a bubbling effect. Artists that are using paints with texture are doing something called impasto. Impasto is the concept of applying your paint so thickly that it has a cake batter consistency. That's done with oil paints. So with oil paints, which we'll learn next week when we go over the different mediums, if you add less turpentine, the paint will be thicker. If you add more turpentine, it'll be thinner. So impasto painting with oil paints means that they are not adding very much turpentine at all to give it that thick cake batter consistency. And then it's applied directly to the canvas, sometimes with a brush, sometimes with a spatula, sometimes with their fingers. An example of impasto, or an artist that used impasto, is Van Gogh's Starry Night. So if we were to look at this in real life, we would see the bumps and the lines with the thick paint application. An example of an artist that implies texture is Jan van Eyck in his Arnolfini portrait. So he used such thin, tiny brush strokes in his painting, the Arnolfini portrait, that he was able to imply the richness of different fabric textures. Which we can kind of see here. You can make out the brush head here, the opulence of the gold chandelier. You can see her fur there, his fur. You can see the different textures. These are implied textures to try and give us a sense of realism for the piece. In fact, he got so particular with his textures that in the background here, you can see he has made a mirror. The mirror reflects back this couple that's kind of cut off here and Jan van Eyck in the portrait. And I guess that's all that we have in it. Any questions about texture or color? I thought there was one more slide. Maybe that's a different PowerPoint. I'm thinking of something else. Color texture questions. Those were the last two concepts to cover for composition. And if there's no questions about composition, then we're going to move into the next topic, which is all about the principles of design. This one's a little bit more fun. At least to me, it's a little bit more fun. Suppose I should share it. Okay, so you guys should be seeing a presentation. So for this one, I definitely deviated from your book quite a bit because I decided to pull all of the examples for these different principles from the Fort Worth Museum of Modern Art. So if you are ever in the Fort Worth area, you might want to pop in so that you can actually see all of these things that we're going to be looking at in person. So to start off with this section, I kind of pulled all of your major key terms into one spot. So I'll give you guys a bit of time to write these. Of course, we'll be looking at different examples of every single one of these key terms as we go through these principles. Asymmetrical balance is when things are balanced but not entirely symmetrical. Symmetrical being that it's the same on one side and the other. So down at the bottom, you can see symmetrical balance is near perfect exact balance, meaning it's almost identical on each side. Asymmetrical balance has a lot to do with the different weights of colors. So it has to do with that color theory that we just talked about. Directional forces are lines that draw your focus to a specific spot. A focal point is the main point of the picture where almost all of your attention is directed thanks to those directional forces. And then scale is the size of something in relation to something else. Okay, so we're actually going to skip this one. This was for when this was originally a 16-week course, is what that was about. So actually, I will touch on the fact that lately we have been studying the ideas of composition and what goes into composition. There's a lot that artists have to take into account when they're making their compositions to start off with. There's a lot of trial and error and experimenting, which we've learned. There's a lot of ideas about what colors to use, what kinds of lines do I want to use to convey a certain meaning or feeling. The principles of design kind of encompass all of those things together. So it kind of culminates here, all of the things that we've been talking about lately. And the principle of design is all about what steps artists go through to organize their artworks. So here I have a quote from the artist Roy Lichtenstein. Organized perception is what art is all about. So we are going to be looking at different principles of design in relation to how artists chose to organize what they were wanting you to perceive as a viewer. And here is a work from Roy Lichtenstein, just to give you an idea of what he would do. He's from the pop art era. Pop art is all about easily digestible artworks that are popular or use popular subject matter. So here we see Drowning Girl, which of course is referencing comic books from that time period. And we'll take a closer look at Roy Lichtenstein when we go over art history. So our different principles of design that we're going to be covering today are unity and variety, balance, emphasis and subordination, directional forces, contrast, repetition and rhythm, and scale and proportion. We're going to be going through every single one of these principles and looking at different examples of each. Kind of like when we did all of the purposes of art. Starting off with unity and variety. Unity is the appearance of oneness or being cohesive. So can someone unmute and tell me how this painting that we're looking at by Yves Klein is cohesive? What makes it cohesive? Don't think too hard, guys.
It's all one color.
Yeah, exactly. It's all one color, specifically the color blue. So that is a great, I chose some pretty obvious examples, obviously, of unity and oneness. Here is Yves Klein, IKB Got It. He is part of the contemporary abstract movement that came about after World War II. And he always did all of his artworks in what he called Yves Klein blue. He actually coined this particular shade of blue. And that was the shade that he always used, which you can see again here. People begin to fly. So not only is this one unified because it all uses the color blue, but what else makes this particular piece cohesive? Has to do with the subject matter.
The flying people.
Yeah, all of the people that are all flying. Yeah, exactly. So how he would do this piece is he would actually put on performance shows, and people would go to pay to see this done. There'd be an orchestra hired to play in the background even, and all it was is female models would paint their bodies in the Yves Klein blue paint, and then he would go and spray paint around them as they pressed themselves against the canvas. It's pretty simple. Once again, part of the contemporary abstract movement. Here's another one. This is a series of works by Bernd and Hilla Becker. They're a husband and wife duo that go around and take photographs of water towers. All of the photographs are always the same size and the same compositional styling. always black and white. So what are some of the things that make this cohesive? There's quite a few.
Is it the colors?
So yeah, part of the cohesiveness on this one is that they are all in black and white, so achromatic. What else makes this cohesive? Because there's a lot.
The trees.
Nope, not the trees.
The water towers?
The water towers, the subject matter. Every single one of their photographs has the same subject matter, that being a water tower. Also, the positioning of the water tower. It is located in the very central area of the picture plane. This is also a great example of symmetry. If we divided this in half, it'd be the same on each side. What else makes it cohesive? Because there's something else yet.
Would it be the sky background?
Kind of, not really. I'm thinking more obvious. This is a series. Has to do with,
They're older.
nope. They're actually pretty new.
Really?
Yeah, they're just done in black and white.
Oh.
Yep.
So why would
Photography has been around since the early 1900s. It just didn't get used prevalently until the 70s. And a lot of artists still choose to use black and white. Now, the last bit of cohesiveness here is that they are all the same size photograph. So the obvious one.
I'm still pretty convinced on the trees.
Not all of them have trees and they aren't the same kind of trees. But if you want to say that makes it cohesive, that's fine. That can be your opinion, and art is full of opinions. Okay, so variety is kind of the opposite of unity. You can still have unity with variety, which we'll talk about an example of that in a second. But variety helps to break things up and provide a little bit of diversity, because sometimes too much unity can be boring. So here's an example of variety and unity working together. You can see that there is still a cohesive theme throughout this Precious Stones series, the theme being that they all have the medallion in the background and it's all a female figure with a flower in the foreground. But the variety is that they're all in different poses, they all have different colors, and there is a different styling going on with all of the backgrounds, midgrounds, and foregrounds. So there's unity and variety. And here's another example of unity and variety working well together. How is this piece unified? Has to do with one of the vocabulary words you just learned in the last section. Huh?
Symmetry?
It can be symmetry, kind of. This is asymmetrical balance, if you really want to go there already, but that's the complicated one. But yeah, it is balance. Last chapter, you learned a vocabulary word for...
Monochromatic?
Not monochromatic, but achromatic. But yeah, it is an achromatic painting, meaning that there are no hues or colors used in it, so that helps make it a little bit more unified. If there was like a red splotch in here somewhere, it wouldn't have very much unity. But the fact that the artist chose to use absolutely no hues and just blacks, whites, and grays makes it a little bit more unified. How is there variety?
Is it because of the different weights that are in there?
Yeah, so there's different tints and shades for every single one of these boxes, which helps add variety. The other big one is that they're different sizes except for these two in the center. The others are all different sizes. All right, and I believe this is our last example of unity and variety working together. How are these pieces unified?
They're all in the same position on the wall.
Yeah. What else?
They're all kind of angled towards north east if we're looking at a compass.
Okay. What else? Big one.
They're all solid colors.
They're all solid colors. Yeah. What else? Has to do with shapes. We learned about shapes yesterday too.
Lines?
Huh?
About the lines?
Kind of. So yesterday we learned that there's three kinds of shapes. There's geometric shapes, there's organic, and there's biomorphic. What kind of shapes would these all be? Would these be geometric shapes, organic shapes, or biomorphic shapes? Oof, you guys are overthinking it today.
The red one's a little bit organic with the way it rounds. So
Organic shapes are ones that can be found in nature. Do we see shapes like this in nature?
no.
No.
Geometric?
Yes, these are more geometric shapes. So we have geometric shapes that are all in the same position on the wall. They're all done in a solid color. And if we want to get super technical, these are all handmade canvases. Normal canvases don't come in this shape. So the artist Ellsworth Kelly had to hand make these to get them that shape. And how is there variety?
They're different colors.
Yep. What else?
They're different shapes.
Yes, they're all different shapes and different colors. Very good. And then completely opposite of unity and variety is complete disorder. This is most often seen in abstract art. That's the casual application of brush strokes. There is a sense of disorder in these paintings. An example of a painting that uses complete disorder is Joan Mitchell's Untitled. And she worked very closely with Jackson Pollock. If you know who that is, then you might understand why it looks kind of like his. And if you don't know who Jackson Pollock is, well, you will by the end of this semester. Moving on from unity and variety to balance. Balance is either symmetry or asymmetry, if you remember those vocabulary words. We're going to first look at symmetrical balance, and then we'll get into the super technical one, asymmetrical balance. Can someone refresh our brains as to what the definition of symmetrical balance is? Someone that wrote it down.
It's no, wait. You go ahead.
Did you say symmetrical balance?
Yes.
Here, perfect balance or exact balance.
Yes, perfect or exact balance. So basically, if we divide something in half, it should be almost identical on each side. So if we were to fold this Mark Rothko painting in half, which we would never do because it's worth many millions of dollars, but if we folded it in half, it would be almost identical. So this is a great example of symmetrical balance. It's also a great example of color theory, but we'll get into that later on. Another example of symmetry can be seen in Martin Puryear's ladder for Booker T. Washington. If we cut this ladder in half, we would see that it is nearly symmetrical on each side. It's because that's how ladders work. And another example of symmetrical balance can be seen in Rorschach, the Endless Column 1. These are silver-plated objects that have been crushed with an industrial press, and they have been bolted to the floor. And if we were to cut this in half, we would see that it is nearly the same on each side. Questions about symmetrical balance before we get into the complicated one? Okay. Asymmetrical balance is when things are balanced, but not like the last one. The last one is if we divided it in half or folded it in half, it would be the same on each side. Asymmetrical balance has to do with the color theory that I mentioned in the last section, where certain colors have more weight than others or mass than others. For example, just a reminder, cool colors have more weight than warm colors. But this is a great example of asymmetry here. So if we divide this painting on an angle, almost the entire subject matter is in the bottom triangle, and the top triangle is a solid blue. Blue is a cool toned color, so it has a lot of weight. But because Ed Ruscha has made the entire subject matter in the bottom triangle, there's a lot going on down here too that helps give the bottom half weight. If you remember, white and red don't have very much mass as far as colors. White has absolutely no mass, and red is on the warm side, so it doesn't either. So this is where I said we get technical. We're applying color theory in the psychological analysis that certain colors have more mass in our brains. So because of the solid blue in the upper right-hand corner here, it has an equal mass or weight to the bottom left-hand corner, even though all of the subject matter is down here. So this is asymmetry. It's still balanced, but not like if we just folded it in half, it would be the same. Because clearly if we folded this painting in half, it would not be the same at all. Another example of asymmetrical balance is Clyfford Still's Untitled. Once again, this has to do with the fact that black has a lot of mass. So if we were to fold this in half, the solid yellow side still has a lot of mass, but the other side has a lot of mass as well, despite the fact that there's a bunch of white. Remember, white has no mass, but because they added in the black, it's balanced out. This is super complicated. I am fully aware. I will never ever ask you to try and examine an art piece and discuss how it's asymmetrically balanced because it's very complicated. Moving on from symmetrical balance and asymmetrical balance to emphasis in subordination. This one's fun. That's using directional forces and focal points to take our eyes to particular areas of the paintings. So artists oftentimes will emphasize certain areas of the painting because that's what they want us to pay more attention to. And this is an example here of that happening. We have an emphasis placed on Mary Magdalene and Christ's interaction up here, and subordination is placed on the background image. Emphasis on the foreground, subordination on the background, because Fontana wanted us to pay attention more to the story that was happening in the front. And like I said, emphasis and subordination has a lot to do with those directional forces that lead our eye to a particular focal point. Here we see Eugene Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. Just looking at this first glance, what do you think the main focal point of this painting is? Just right off the bat.
The person holding a flag.
Exactly, the person holding the flag, which is actually supposed to represent Lady Liberty. This was done for the French Revolution, but there is a lot of emphasis placed on her thanks to those directional forces. Directional forces, once again, are lines that lead our eye. So here we see a line from the man's gun leading to her. The blue stripe of the flag also leads to her. The boy's arms lead to her. His eyes are looking at her. Even the naked man's legs lead to her. So all of the major lines that we see in this painting take us to her. There's also emphasis placed on her because she has a bit of a spotlight glow on her. So it looks almost like she's on a stage and there's a spotlight hitting down on her, which helps also add to the sense that she is our focal point here. So there's a lot of emphasis placed on her, once again, because she is a personification of liberty during the French Revolution, whereas everyone else in the background has subordination to her. Another example of directional forces being used here is the raft of the Medusa. Any guesses as to what the focal point in this painting is? Or who? What or who?
The dude with the flag.
Yeah, the dude with the flag at the top right here. Particularly the flag itself is where our focal point is. So if you notice, all of the lines of the painting end up taking you to him. Your eye is led from the bottom of the raft up to that flag. That being said, that if you have really good eyesight, you may be able to make out the little dot right here. That is a ship. So these guys have been stranded in a shipwreck and they are trying to signal the ship off into the distance to try and rescue them. And I'm pretty sure we're going to talk a lot more about this when we get to the Romantic period of art, because this is a cool story. And it's a real story too. Okay, contrast are two opposing forces placed near each other. This one's pretty easy. So here we have Joseph Havel's drape in bronze. The medium for this piece is going to be very important for you in it. Bronze is a metal, drapes are not. So once again, contrast are two opposing forces near each other. The art piece here is that sculpture right in the center, not the background, not the building. The art piece is here. What is a drape usually made of?
Cloth.
Cloth. What is this drape made of?
Bronze.
Okay, so normal drapes are made of cloth and they're tactile and they move. Bronze is hard and solid and not movable. So how is there contrast here? Kind of gave you the answer. What's the contrast?
The flow of the material.
Hard. You already answered it once. So fabric is soft. Bronze is hard. What's the contrast?
Texture.
Texture. Very good. So normal drapes should be soft and movable. This one is clearly not. So there's a contrast between what a drape should be and what this artist has created for a drape. If you want to include the building, because technically this building is made by an artist, you have the contrast of the concrete wall in the back juxtaposed to a wall of windows. So you have solid and airy right next to each other. I say that because every time I show this image, people include the building. Although you guys did not. Thank you for that. Moving on from contrast, which are two things juxtaposed to each other, to repetition and rhythm. Repetition and rhythm is probably the most basic one. That's just a repeating of things over and over again. Such as Jenny Holzer's Kind of Blue, which are 9 LED signs in blue diodes that repeat over and over again. She's the one that did the ticker tape that we talked about yesterday that goes around the museum. This is another example of a piece that constantly rotates over and over the same sentence. So there's a lot of repetition in the fact that it says the same sentence over and over. There's also repetition in the fact that it says it over and over 9 times. Another example of repetition and rhythm is Donald Judd's Entitled. We have a repeating same box over and over and over again. They're all identical. Literally, because they were mass produced, so they're all identical. Now, a different example of repetition and rhythm that we don't always associate happens in things like comic books, comic strips, and stories. You'll see the same characters used over and over again in a newspaper comic or a comic book. Here's the old example, the early example of comic books. So this is a hand scroll. Normally it'd be a rolled up scroll. And as you read it, you would start from right to left and start unrolling it. And you would see the characters act out throughout the story, like comic book characters performing different activities throughout the story. And so you'd see the same characters over and over again in the story. So there's a repetition in seeing those characters again and again and again. Now, scale and proportion, that's the size of things in relation of other things. And we're almost done, which means we'll finish early today. So here we see Giotto's Madonna. Here's a bad example of scale and proportion. Well, actually not really bad. You can see that the Madonna enthroned with Christ on her lap is quite a lot larger in scale to those surrounding her. That's because this was done in the early Renaissance period, and they didn't understand how to make important figures look important without making than everyone else. So how they chose to show importance was based on scale. We're actually going to see a lot of what's called hierarchic scale in art history when we get to that section. Hierarchic scale is the idea of showing important figures as being larger than everyone else. So kings would be portrayed larger than their subjects. And of course, the smaller you were, the less important you are. So here we see the Madonna with Christ enthroned. Christ is almost as big as the angels, and he's just a baby. Another example of some interesting scale and proportion can be seen in the Madonna with the long neck. I am actually going to go ahead and show you this video because we haven't really watched many videos in this class. I think this will be the second. Because this particular painting has quite a bit going on with scale and proportion in particular. Now we're finally going to go. Okay. I was worried there was something wrong with my computer because it wasn't doing anything. Ooh. I don't know what just happened with my internet, but it took a dump.
So here we're looking at the great Mannerist painting by Parmigianino called The Madonna with the Long Neck. It's a fun painting.
And it's a tall painting. It's a big painting.
Big.
Are you guys seeing this?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you.
Big, and Madonna is big. She's big in funny places too. If you look at her head is really tiny.
Compared to her hips especially.
Right, she's got really, really wide hips. And then she comes down on these tiny little toes. So it's always seemed to me like her body is in the shape of a diamond.
In a sense, she's a landscape on which Christ sits.
Christ himself is also quite large.
It's not just large, but look at the way he splays his body. There's this crazy kind of torsion with his arm falling dislocated from his shoulder.
There is a precedent for that way that his left arm falls down. If you think about Michelangelo's Pietà, and Christ here as a child, but perhaps echoing when Mary will hold Christ in images like the Pietà when Christ is dead. And in fact, Christ looks asleep, but there's also a way that he looks dead too.
So that reference actually in some ways explains the mass of her lap, because in that sculpture, Mary is quite substantial in order to be able to support the dead body of her son.
It's so clear when we're looking at this that we're not in the High Renaissance anymore.
So what happened?
Yeah, mannerism happened. It's almost like the artists of the High Renaissance had done everything that could be done. They had perfected the naturalism that they had sought after since the time of Giotto.
So all of the illusionism that was at the service of the High Renaissance is here being used to distort and to transform the body. It's not so much an ugly deformation as a kind of deformation that accentuates a kind of extreme elegance.
Exactly. It takes that ideal beauty and elegance that was in the High Renaissance, that was there, and exaggerates it. And one way of thinking about mannerism is to think about it as art taken from art instead of art from nature. You know, we think about the Renaissance as being based on observation of nature and the natural world. But when you look at this, you think back to works of art like Michelangelo's Giuliano de' Medici and that long neck, or back to the Pietà.
That makes a lot of sense, the idea that this is art that is self-referential, that is referring to its own traditions.
The respect for human anatomy and portraying that naturalistically, that's not important to mannerists. In fact, I think there's a letter from one mannerist artist to another mannerist artist where he says something like, take a left hand and put it on a right arm. It's like there's a willful complicating of the body. And
setting up relationships between forms that are absurd. Look at the relationship between the vase that's being held by the angel in relationship to his, her thigh. Look at the relationship between the massive Virgin Mary and the prophet in the lower right corner that is presumably impossibly far away, but somehow just a tiny figure at the feet of the Virgin.
And look too at the way that the Virgin holds her hand to her chest with these impossibly long, almost boneless fingers. There's a way in which the gesture fails to mean anything.
It means gesture,
yeah,
as opposed
to
a specific intent of the figure.
Yeah, there's a kind of dramatizing here.
For its own sake.
Exactly.
For its own sake. That kind of willful compression that creates a sense of almost the impossible. If you look at the columns on the right, there's actually a colonnade that is so deep in space, it's seen at such an oblique angle that it almost seems like a wall or a single column. But if you look closely at the base, you can see the alternating light and shadow that passes between those columns. But there is ambiguity, and that's in large part because that part of the painting is not finished. So mannerism, it seems to be this intense reaction to the perfection of the High Renaissance. You know, you have the Renaissance, in a sense, building itself into a kind of extreme naturalism, and then there seems to be almost a kind of flailing reaction against those strictures.
Or a sense that there was no...
So it briefly went over there all of the issues with the scale and proportion in the Madonna with the long neck. Once again, just to reiterate for anyone that might have missed it, or if that video wasn't clear in some parts, just think of the man, the prophet in the corner, in comparison to Mary. He is a very small miniature figure. At this point in time, they did understand this was post-Renaissance. They knew what proper scale and proportion looked like. It's just like they said with mannerism, the period that follows the Renaissance, some artists chose to disregard normal scale and proportion and do what they wanted to do. So sometimes artists will purposefully choose to ignore normal principles of design and do their own thing, which is important to keep in mind as we go forward with the class. That's actually it for our principles of design. So we went over the last two principles of composition, color and texture, and then we went over all of the principles of design today. Tomorrow, we are going to go over art criticism, and the topic of censorship. Some of you might have noticed the new announcement on Canvas that pertains to your censorship project that you have coming up. Your censorship project is a group project over the topic of censorship, which once again, we're going over tomorrow. I have gone ahead and made the groupings for you. So you might want to take a look at who's in your group before class tomorrow, so that you know who you need to connect with to work on this group project. Which once again, we are going to start going over tomorrow. I would highly encourage you to read tomorrow's chapter since it's only about 4 pages long. It's the shortest chapter in the book, and that's all that we're going to go over tomorrow, just that one section. And then I'm going to give you guys time to connect with your group members and start thinking about your project as well. So once again, you might want to take a peek at that Canvas announcement or the censorship module, which also has the same information as the announcement does. And come prepared with any questions that you might have for me. Come prepared with who's in your group so you know who you need to get information from for like emails or phone numbers, whatever you prefer. Be ready for that tomorrow, okay? Other than that, I am done with you guys today. If you came in late, you're going to want to stick around to make sure that I got you counted. But if you came early, I already got you and you're free to go. Enjoy the rest of your day off, and stay warm and stay safe. And keep a lookout for any notifications about on-campus classes tomorrow too, just in case they have to extend the cancellation. If it's still canceled for on-campus, we'll meet again on here. But if it's okay for us to go back to the campus, then we'll meet on campus tomorrow, okay? Once again, if you came in late, stick around so that I can get you counted. Alexa, Armando, Brittany, Courtney, Fabian, I got you guys. Grace, I have you. Litzy, I got you. Magali, I got you. Marshall, you're good. Victoria, you're good. Alexa, you're good. I got everyone else. Okay, everyone's good to go. Thanks, guys.